Good afternoon and welcome to the second of two webcasts on the business of corporate learning. I'm delighted to be joined again by Professor Shlomo Ben-Hur. So Shlomo, last week we looked at the general state of corporate learning, and today we're going a little bit further. We're looking at the strategy. Strategy is one of those words that can mean a lot of different things to different people. What's your understanding of strategy and its place in corporate learning?
It's actually quite straightforward, Paul. I mean, whether you are building a new corporate university, I mean, you are re-engineering or kind of like reimagining it, or you're extending it beyond sort of like its current scope, you need to have a strategic plan. I mean, and when most people ask me, what is it that I focus on when I talk about the learning strategy, I would say it's three words. It's alignment, alignment, and alignment. And I'm saying that because usually the tendency will be to say, let's focus on the alignment with the business goals. And I'm not against that. I mean, I would say that's a very critical thing that we need to get right. I mean, to make sure that the business imperatives are reflected in the learning strategy. And obviously the first thing that people think about, it's the alignment with the business imperatives. I mean, and I'm a very strong advocate of that. I mean, I think you need to have this in order to have a good learning strategy. But my focus and my area of concentration will see the alignment between the different elements within your learning strategy. So it's the how does it all fit together. So like the different parts of the how and how do they relate to each other. That would be things like the mission, like the structures and policies that you have, like the structure of your portfolio, all of that. I mean, if that's not aligned, I mean, in the business strategy, we know that if the learning strategy is not aligned with the business strategy, it's not going to be perceived as valuable. But if these different elements of your learning strategy itself are not aligned with each other, then you don't really have a strategy at all.
So Shlomo, why might that not happen? Why might the individual learning pieces in that strategy, why might they not be aligned?
I think partially because there's a tendency to sort of like please customers. I mean, and to go and do what your first customer that you come across in the elevator or your biggest supporter in the organization is asking for, and you run and you get into the actionism mode of what a lot of learning functions are busy doing, delivering to that specific request. If you don't go back and say, where does that fit on my strategic considerations? Where does it fit in terms of my positioning and my raison d'etre? You're going to be ending up actually addressing the wrong things.
Shlomo, in your new book, you lay out a map for corporate learning strategy. What are the key elements of that map?
Yeah, so there are actually a number of key elements, I mean, in this decision pathway that you want to embark on or engage in as a head of learning or as a person who is trying to construct that learning strategy. I mean, and the first one is really the mission, kind of like the very raison d'etre of your organization. What is it that is kind of like identified as the mandate for your learning function? What is it that is expected of you as an organizational entity to deliver for the organization? The second one is the scope. And the scope means really the focus on the operationalization of the mission. I mean, it's kind of like the critical decisions that you need to make of what's in the scope and what's out of scope, I mean, for the learning entity. Then comes the organizational positioning. And that is really sort of like, where are you locating or placing your learning entity? I mean, in terms of reporting line, in terms of interfaces with critical decision-making entities and operational processes in the organization, whether it sits in this part or the other part, is it a matrix? I mean, where is it that the decisions are being made? And that has specific implications to the operating model. And that means, how do you operate as an organization in terms of the internal design of your learning entity, the kind of processes, the systems that you have, the foundations of your operations. And last but not least, I mean, that would have implications on your portfolio. And when we talk about portfolio, it's really the programs and services that you provide as a learning entity. All of these things, I mean, in a highly connected kind of world, will translate into the building blocks of your learning strategy.
So Shlomo, you seem to be suggesting that mission is the place to start. People watching today may say, well, that sounds obvious, but based on your research, that doesn't always happen.
Yeah, so I've been around long enough in organizations and have worked with a wide range of clients to know that when you talk about mission, people feel that this is passé. I mean, this is kind of like the 80s phenomena. Something that we used to do and didn't really like because it ended up, in our drawers. And not something that we actually engaged in and made it a tool for our operations. But I would argue that this is not because mission is not a good idea. It's because of a very poor implementation that was causing some of this. And I would continue to argue, and I do that with every discussion that I have with learning people, is that this is the source of all good learning offers in organizations. That if you don't take the time to actually define your raison d'être, the very mission of why you exist, you will end up with all different side routes that you take instead of really getting to the place. In a recent survey, not a survey actually, it's a meeting with a whole range of chief learning officers that we had at IMD here on campus. When I asked how many people have a well-developed and articulated mission statement, more than half of the people said they don't have it. And I see that as one of the sources of all evils, to say if we don't have that right, we might really end up suffering from a lot of other symptomatic demonstrations of inefficiencies and ineffectiveness without knowing why we're facing those.
Would it be fair to say that if you don't define your mission for corporate learning, somebody else in the organization will do it for you?
Absolutely. That's the risk that you take.
So Shlomo, you mentioned mission, which seems to underpin everything in this model. Help us now dig into scope. How can we understand what might be in or out of scope?
Yeah, so if your mission is kind of like your field of responsibility, then scope is about boundaries. If your mission is your compass that tells you where you're going, then the scope is like the sextant. Is kind of like making sure that you are on course. And there are three key areas that kind of like I see as critical for scope. The first one is your target population. That means who is it that you're addressing all-heartedly, as part of your mission. That could be that you are addressing only the management population. Or it could be that as a learning function you are focusing on talent and therefore you're addressing the high potentials in the organization. On the other hand, it could be that you are working for an organization that have identified 3 key job families, and those are the ones that we focus on. So the first part of scope is to really define that target population. The second one is really about learning objectives, in terms of your deliverables. Meaning here we focus on what is it that we offer? Are we offering training programs? Are we offering consulting services? Is it online? Is it face-to-face? What kind of deliverables are there to address my learning objectives? That is kind of like the scope of your activity. And the last thing is really focusing on your relationships or really the interfaces that you have in the organization. And the third one is interfaces. And by interfaces we mean who are the different entities in the organization in the learning areas, but also in the business areas that this function need to interface with. It's quite a complex set of elements, and with more budget pressures that we see in organizations, and with more pressure on the learning entity to actually align its offer with talent management processes, which is definitely a tendency that we see developing in the last 5 to 7 years, this has gotten even more complex. So you want to make sure that you are answering the questions to the CEOs or business unit heads who are saying, are you really spending the money where the money should be spent? And that is a scope question. And the other question that comes usually from HR, are you aligning all of your learning offers with the talent management processes? And that is a scope kind of a question. So the choices that you make around scope, in terms of what's in the scope and what's out of scope, are actually increasingly critical for the survival and success of the learning function.
So Shlomo, if I come to the conclusion that my positioning, the positioning of my function within the organization isn't optimal, what can I do about that? What are the levers that I can pull to adjust that?
So you might need to really go back and renegotiate your mandate. I mean, if this is a fundamental issue, you might want to link it to other processes in the organization that would give more impetus to your learning offer. Or you might want to go and create more of a grassroots kind of like commitment to your organizational learning entity in order to make sure that you're tied to the key decision makers in the organization.
So Shlomo, what exactly do you mean by positioning? People may be looking at this model and say, I can't really do much about my positioning. It's effectively already been attributed to me.
Well, indeed. I mean, in many cases, this is already an inherited condition. I mean, so like where you are in the organizational chart and how you're positioned is already there. But it doesn't mean that it cannot be managed or influenced by the head of learning or by the learning function in its totality. Because what we need is people who are acutely aware of the inherited conditions and kind of like constructively and proactively manage and mitigate any of the liabilities or the risks that are associated with that positioning. And I think that's very important to say. First of all, you really need to make sure that you realize what the message is about your organizational positioning in terms of commitment of the top leadership in the business to the existence of the learning function. Then it's something about your access to key decision makers in the organization. I mean, if you're positioned at a high-level position reporting to the board of the organization, or you are reporting to the vice president of HR who is sitting in that forum, or you're reporting to the CEO of the business, that says a very different thing than if you're reporting to the head of talent management in the HR area, in which maybe there is no voice in the board of the organization. It also is an indication of the level of autonomy that you have, I mean, which is a very important thing for us to gauge. I mean, as we're looking at sort of like the portfolio of offerings and services that we offer to the organization. And last but not least, I mean, if you don't have enough authority to act, you will run into implementation issues. So being conscious of the positioning, you might be able to foresee implementation issues and therefore mitigate them.
Shlomo, we're working our way around your map. Let's dig into operating model. What exactly do we mean by that?
Yeah, so when we talk about operating model, it's actually all focused on what business are we really in? I mean, how do we create value for the organization? So I would agree that sort of like there's a shared perspective that all learning entities are busy trying to make money for the organization through performance support and improvement. But as the old saying goes, I mean, there's different ways of skinning a cat. And you really have to say, how do we kind of like envisage the value creation? And what are the implications that that has on all of these other parts of the model? Because if you're looking at sort of like rolling out hundreds of training programs to the organization, then you are much more of a manufacturing kind of like an entity. You're like the training arm of the business, I mean, the training factory. But on the other hand, I mean, if you're engaged with facilitating change, I mean, in helping cultural transformation or post-merger integration or whatever that is, you actually resemble much more an organizational consulting kind of like an entity. And if neither one of those is really your operating model, but you are focusing on leadership development or grooming of talent from lower in the organization in terms of identification of high potentials and development of those people, then you look much more like a business school such as IMD.
Shlomo, what do you see as the key issues in building an effective portfolio?
Well, a portfolio is actually always emergent because, as we know, I mean, as you go through the months in the year, no matter what you came in with, I mean, there's always sort of like needs that are getting identified. I mean, business people who are calling you into meetings, I mean, is the learning function asking for things. But the important thing is that we will have some kind of a clear mindset as to what the plan is. I mean, in some organizations formulate an annual plan where they sort of like have the budget, I mean, associated with that. And that is a very critical process when it comes to this because like with operational model, I mean, it is something that needs to be connected with your mission and overall where it is that you're going. It has to do something with your operating model. It has to be related to your scope. But that's a very rational process. And what we know happens in organizations is that there's consistently sort of like budgetary pressures that come to play, and there's the political sort of like influences that take place that are creating sort of like more pressure on sort of like the formulation of your portfolio. You need to be, first of all, clear about your priorities, I mean, as they are reflected in the portfolio. And that is something that looks quite simple, because if you go back to the model, I mean, there's like some very clear inferences that you could draw from your mission as to what it is that you want to prioritize. But on the other hand, I mean, there is the complexity that gets created because of those political pressures or budgetary constraints. Then it's how do you want to go about structuring your portfolio? In a lot of organizations, they do this, I mean, based on the level of people. So depending on where I am ranking in the organization, I go and I find sort of like the learning offer that's available to me. I would argue that a better way to look at that is actually trying to link that back to the objectives. I mean, in terms of what it is that you're trying to do, and then portray the portfolio at the different levels based on each one of those objectives. But there's a whole sort of like art to this, and organizations wrestle with that, because one of the things that we find is that in spite of all of the best efforts, you still run into organizations that would have 35 different programs that are actually addressing the very same need, and customers who are looking to find out where it is that they can find what's available to them in a huge portfolio of services. And the last thing is the when question. I mean, in terms of like, when do you establish your portfolio? And I would argue that here it's important to have an annual plan. I mean, to be clear on what it is that you're going to be offering, but also to leave some flexibility to some critical decision points around your scope and mission and the priorities that are being identified on an ongoing basis in an organization to be reflected in your portfolio of offering.
So it sounds like, Shlomo, the golden rules around building a portfolio are keep it simple and allow it to evolve.
Yeah, keep it simple. Be aware of what it is that you're doing. I mean, in terms of like really being conscious of the choices you're making, and then allow it to evolve.
Shlomo, last week we looked at the general state of corporate learning. Today we've been digging into the strategy. These are areas that are covered in your book, The Business of Corporate Learning. If there's one key takeaway that you'd like people to remember from your book, what would it be?
If I'm looking at this book, I think the summary of that is that it's a call for action. I mean, it's a call for action for organizations to recognize the importance of getting corporate learning right. And it's a call for action for the learning professionals to say, you actually have a great asset in your hand, and you need to nurture that, measure it, and offer it in the best way possible for organizations. I also hope that through the reading of the book, I mean, people would realize that this is quite a complex field. I mean, this is not sort of like the old training department that you could have put anyone there, I mean, to deliver some seminars. This actually has to do with the unleashing the discretionary performance in the organization based on the motivation that you are unleashing on behalf of the learners, and based on sort of like the good work that the learning entity could be doing with the support of top management that will see that as a critical lever for their success as leaders in organizations.
Shlomo, thanks so much for being with us today and for sharing insights from your new book, The Business of Corporate Learning.
It's been my pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this useful and insightful, and we look forward to seeing you back in the virtual world of IMD on another webcast very soon.